Review code for Runner 3 provided by Choice Provisions.
Today's thrilling episode is brought to you in part by Burger Mouth Burger Brand Mouth Broth, another common beverage by Schlortz.
Bit Trip Runner was originally part of a series dubbed The Bit Trip, small rhythmic titles developed by an indie dev team, Gaijin Games, now known as Choice Provisions, originally exclusive to the Wii as digital content. Runner would be the only title in this bundle of modest games to spawn its own separate series. This is mainly a review for Runner 3, the latest installment to the branched-off Runner series. I will briefly cover the original two games, but if you're already aware of them, or simply want to hear what I have to say about this brand new game, skip to this time. One cannot pinpoint Bit Trip Runner's genre immediately. Bit of a rhythm game, bit of a platformer, and bit of an auto runner. Heh. Par for the course of this Bit Trip series, each title seems to dip into multiple mechanics to describe each experience, from bullet hell to aggressive Pong. First thing anybody will notice about Runner is the visuals. This game originally launched in 2010. Anyone that was paying mind to indie games around this period, what's the first thing you may think of? Probably a bunch of games that look like this. Many independent game developers heavily relied on simple sprite designs and semblance of a unique art style. Ignoring the gameplay aspects of these titles, which most of them are competent in their own ways, do you think all of these will stand the test of time? There's tons of classic games that can be shown decades later and recognized immediately. The legacy they leave is heavily aided by its visual design. I genuinely believe a handful of these indie titles will have their place in history, but do you really think people years later can recognize this? Never mind games that took this retro style to a whole other plane that's incomprehensible. Back to Bit Trip Runner. Some of its visuals are definitely more of the same in that regard, especially Commander Video himself looking like the monolith with limbs, but it also shows an interesting art style in the environment surrounding him. You see what looks like a flourishing, busy community happening in the background, and others being ever so curious about what Video is doing. The world's rhythmic animation makes a great compliment to how stiff the protagonist himself is. Besides gameplay, what else is important in a rhythm game? The music, of course. Ignoring the two annoying Anamanaguchi contributions, there's only one song per each world, with two different mixes. The track starts very calm and soft, but transitions into a heavier, more exciting sense as you power yourself up throughout each stage. Up until the home stretch, that's when it becomes more airy, as a signal that you've almost reached your goal. It gives off a very whimsical vibe throughout the entire game, only disrupted by the crunchier and meaner boss track. Merely about a 10-second loop, but nails the feeling of this intense situation. It's almost nerve-wracking to the player in the midst of these fights. The gameplay is extremely simple, reacting to the beat of the tune with all kinds of obstacles in your way. Jump, kick, block, slide, or springboard ahead to reach the end. And don't forget to snatch up all the gold along the way to unlock bonus stages that's even more retro. You really need to hone your reaction skills because a single screw-up means you have to start over the entire stage. No matter what the challenge is, you have to finish it perfectly or you're thrown all the way back. A lot of people found this mechanic frustrating, but it immediately spoke to me. When it came to platforming games that encourage you to run through it quickly, I loved doing my best clearing them without stop. And if I were to die or take damage, I would restart the entire stage, regardless of checkpoints. I did not mind this demanding mechanic. It encouraged me to whet my reactionary skills to become as sharp as I can make them, or remember the trickier layouts. After all, this is the kind of game where you have to keep looking in front of Commander Video in order to plan out your immediate moves and get through without a hitch. You always have to be a step ahead of the game. The bosses are the real test to this, for they are designed to give you the least amount of leeway for reacting to their obstacles. Each stage only takes a minute or so to complete, so while Bit Trip Runner can be a considerably arduous game, it isn't that discouraging when you mess up the stage as long as you're paying attention and learning from your mistakes. This was certainly not a big title, originating as a cheap WiiWare game, but it had a very unique and enjoyable adventure that made for a satisfying experience. It's no wonder why amongst the rest of the Bit Trip collection, Runner was able to expand upon this plethora of retro-stylized rhythm titles. Speaking of...
Today's thrilling episode is brought to you in part by Pip-Slip Ship Chips. They're ship shape. Now it's time for Bit Trip presents Runner 2, Future Legend of Rhythm Alien.
Almost 3 years later, Gaijin Games would launch a sequel, initially for PC and Wii U. This game would play very similar to Bit Trip Runner, but the visuals saw a complete artistic overhaul. There's a contextual reason in the game's world behind this, but the developers stated they felt it was time to move beyond that style if they're going to continue with games of this series. After 6 Bit Trip titles, I can definitely concur. Choice Provisions made sure that, because this was being made as an individual installment and not part of a collection of small titles, it was going to be a grand step up from the original. Not only are there more unique obstacles to overcome, there's branching paths, secrets to uncover, alternate characters with multiple costumes for each, and more than twice as many unique stages as the original title. The developers also committed a balancing act to please fans of the original, but also ease on its intense challenge in order to welcome newcomers that might not be able to confidently take on the demanding gameplay. Introducing difficulty settings for the game, easy, normal, and hard, the developers claim that hard is more akin to the original game's challenge. Checkpoints became a system for all of the stages to help those struggling to complete them perfectly, but they allow the player to hop over the checkpoint, nullifying it and granting an even higher score when you complete the stage. A very similar mechanic was praised in Shovel Knight, although Runner 2 launched more than a year before that title. This really incentivizes players to learn the area and focus on their reactionary skills in order to complete the stage from beginning to end in one go. On top of that, there's a new taunt move you can perform that has the character in an uninterruptible animation that lasts a single beat. The idea is to keep yourself busy during the stage's downtime, but also risking your run in order to score even more points. This rewards players that can time their beats with their button presses perfectly when they're free of obstacles. So, think you're a step ahead of the game? Think you got perfect rhythm? Prove it with these sweet moves. Branching paths are abundant throughout the game, either granting you an extra stage or harder routes in order to up the current challenge and landing a bigger score. Retro bonus runs, while not present in all stages this time, now feel more akin to the 8-bit NES era and even have a life system, an appropriate way to evolve the concept of this series' bonus runs. The music itself saw an increase in production value. Dropping most of the beeps and boops, we are now hearing more compositions accompanied with instrumentals, fitting these unique worlds perfectly. From the floating city in the clouds, to the serene sun-kissed shores, to the unyielding industrial factory that looks like the bottom of hell. And breaking the silence of the original Bit Trip series, Runner 2 features narration by Charles Martinet, the single man behind the voice of Mario for over 2 decades.
The always imperturbable Commander Video, shielding his elite assemblage of exceptional allies, takes the brunt of the blast and is sucked into an unknown dimension. A land of wondrous imagination, found only at the apex of light and matter.
All this culminates into a most excellent sequel that brings a good round of new mechanics and design to the table, feeling like a fresh take on the original game, both visually and gameplay-wise.
Today's thrilling episode is brought to you in part by Dill and Rooty's Cutie Patooties. It's their children. I'm Charles Martinet, and now it's time for Runner 3!
Fast forward almost 5 years later, Choice Provisions presents us with a brand new installment. As the title implies, this game completes the progression of becoming its own identity. Take a look at this series. First game is titled Bit Trip Runner. Its sequel is named Bit Trip Presents Runner 2, Future Legend of Rhythm Alien, pushing part of the original title further away, but now this game is simply Runner 3, completing its transformation. I guess they realize they're not making Bit Trip Presents Flux 2 anytime soon. Understanding the constant demand for games receiving PC versions, but not forgetting their original roots with Nintendo, Runner 3 launched exclusively on PC and appropriately Switch. Getting right into it, I was blown away. The artists and designers continued to veer into this outwardly absurd style heavily inspired by old cartoons. Even a lot of these sound effects fit perfectly with this wacky take on the Runner world. Speaking of sound, the music, oh man, it is better than ever, each tune being so catchy and upbeat. The game itself opens up with a fantastic recreation of the main theme to the series. Right from the start, how can you not love it? In regards to how differently Runner 3 plays from the original games, it's much more dynamic with its level design, taking advantage of the full 3D perspective in a way the previous titles did not, making you rely on your rhythmic skills just a bit more. Really? Running to the left? On a regular stage? The devils. Vehicles are also added to the mix, often changing the gameplay dramatically for a short period of time. Runner 3 introduces even more new mechanics to the game's design, such as NPCs that request your help, shops to unlock new cosmetics, and more importantly, maneuverability of your character. A new aspect of that is the ground pound move. A tendency I would have in the older games would be overshooting certain jumps, killing my run. This ground pound gives you the opportunity to react quickly in order to keep going. It also has its own separate uses. Double jumping has been added as well. This combined with the ground pound makes it so you can zip upward and downward. It can really help you in a pinch and potentially makes you rethink how to play this game entirely. The stages don't let up either, providing a hefty challenge right at World 1, although each stage has an alternate gem path that grants you more rewards. The way I see it, perfect runs aren't necessarily worth it until you can compare the gold paths with the potential of the gem paths, which you only unlock after completing the first stage. Only then can you evaluate which run will be the most fruitful, score-wise. Abandoning bonus stages, each world you explore in Runner 3 has its own bonus world with a gameplay style completely foreign to the rest of the title and unique bosses. All this is presented with hand-drawn animation for Commander Video and the enemies. Designed as a more traditional platformer, this is a true homage to the classics while being in contrast to the main campaign's core gameplay. The secret stages you unlock through earning enough gold are the ultimate test for any and every runner fan. These trials of terror demand you crank your runner ability to the absolute max. I can barely fathom how they designed stages this insanely difficult. It's especially tough if you want to nab all the gold and gems, like I do. It can be infuriating how much these stages throw at you, but learn the patterns and time everything to the rhythm, you'll show them who's boss. Speaking of boss, their confrontations are dissimilar to the previous entries, bearing a different aspect of mechanics designed like new challenges for you to tear down. If there's one flaw I can criticize, some of these obstacles are deceiving in their appearance. Most notably, the cylindrical objects that lie on the floor. Their hitboxes are significantly smaller than what you're visually led to believe. I have to say the campaign itself does feel a bit on the short side. Runner 2 had 5 separate worlds, but this only has 3. Although I think this can be chalked up to the developers wanting to go with quality over quantity. While there are not as many stages as the previous game, they are much more challenging, have more secrets, unlockables, and varied gameplay. These stages do more than promise big points for you to replay them, so the value in this game's content is certainly still there. It also has a very cute way to distribute the lore of the world for those that want to know more about the game's story and find those collectibles scattered across the world.
The world's inhabitants now found themselves in grave danger. The home they loved so dearly had suddenly and viciously become for the birds.
Definitely more cheeky than the memos I'm used to reading in games, and incredibly fitting to boot. A nitpick I have is some of the animation isn't perfect. I noticed when it came to starting a stage or respawns, some characters' starting animation is not lined up perfectly or is simply too short of a loop that is merely repeated. Perhaps something they can fix in a patch? I've also attained the Nintendo Switch version, and it performs serviceably. No real screw-ups of any sort as far as I can tell. Docked mode, it runs perfectly, but I noticed some frame drops when playing it undocked, especially in the hub world. Nothing devastating for its playability though. It's hard to say if the Runner series should continue past this title. It started as such a simple concept that is two-dimensional auto-running platforming, and was able to take it to great heights with every iteration. All we can really do is see if Choice Provisions ever feels like taking Commander Video on another grand trip. I can't recommend the Runner series enough, especially its latest iteration. This does not feel like a retreading of the previous game, but rather an evolution from what Choice Provisions created previously in every single respect, if not a complete restructuring. Runner 3 brings this trilogy to a close with its stunning levels of challenge, loads of new content, and dynamic design that never wants to let up in surprising the player. This independent rhythmic platformer series has really grown in nearly a decade by a dedicated staff that do their best to make each installment better and better, thus leaving a legacy in the video game industry. I mean, Commander Video got a trophy in Smash Bros. That's gotta count for something, right? With all that said, check out the Runner series if you crave for a challenging platformer that really beats its own unique rhythms from beginning to end. Thanks for watching. Big shout out to Choice Provisions for providing me a code of Runner 3 in order to review it. Always enjoy your team's work and was especially excited for this title. And of course, my ghosties and cool ghouls on Patreon. I can never express my appreciation enough. And if you would like to support me on Patreon to get some neat little rewards, check out the link below.